Guest is one of the many survivors in Forsaken, and is often argued over his reliability. On one hand, there are some pretty crazy guests out there, but on the other hand, guests can oftentimes be one of the most useless survivors in the game. With that said, in today's video, I want to go over why I personally think Guest is a bad survivor. Before I do get into my reasoning, I would like to say, even if I think Guest is bad or not good, it doesn't mean he's bad for everybody. There are, like I said, some really good guest players out there, and they make it work. The dedication is very respectable. But with that said, there is a lot more going against Guest than for him. With that said, today's video is just basically going to be me explaining why Guest is coherently one of the worst survivors in the game. In order to understand the issues with Guest, I'll first explain to you all of his mechanics. Guest has one passive and 3 abilities. His passive gives him hit priority, which basically means he'll take the damage off of a survivor if he's close enough to them. His first ability is block. Once a block is used, he'll negate all damage from most incoming attacks. This does not really apply to status effects or anything of that sort, but it does negate the damage of things like M1s, far-ranged attacks, yada yada. Along with that, block can also unlock his third ability. However, you usually have to use block on an M1 to gain it. There are a few exceptions to this rule though, so keep that in mind. Next up is charge, which just pushes the killer back a little. If done on elevated ground, you'll push the killer pretty far away, and can also be pretty good for pushing the killer down ledges. Finally, we have punch. Punch is how Guest stuns the killer. It can only be unlocked if a block is used successfully. Punch, like 2-tone stagger, has 2 variations, a regular punch and a parry. A regular punch is where you get your punch and hold on to it until you need it or a survivor needs it. This does give less stun time, but can be very good for last second clutches or helping out the team. A parry is where you use punch within the same second you get it. It has a very short windup and allows Guests to be flung forward into the killer. It's pretty hard to land, but it's also really rewarding. Its stun time is a lot higher than a regular punch, and all in all, it's what you should aim for as Guest, so long as the circumstances line up correctly. I'd never recommend using parry on a corner, or if the killer was to, let's say, use a ranged attack and they're far away from you, it just won't work out. Now that you have a good understanding of Guest's abilities, it's time I tell you why they suck so much, or at least why I personally think they at least need a bit of a rework. Starting off with block. Block has 2 main playstyles. Playstyle 1 is prediction. Predicting a killer is how a good 75% of all Guests play. With that said, this is by far the worser way to play him out of the 2 options. Sure, it works out against some killers, and it especially works out if the killer is getting desperate, but more often than not, prediction is a spitfire way to fail a block. Predicting strongly relies on the killer either being dumb enough to fall for it, or just really good mind games. The second and much better way to play Guest is reacting. Reacting to a killer's animations is a really good way to get a free block. It takes the luck out of blocking and guarantees a free punch. The only downsides is a smart killer will try to bait a reaction by quickly spinning around, or the chance you see a killer like 1x use mass infection and mistake it for an M1. However, more often than not, you'll be getting far more punches from reacting than predicting. So why do people choose reacting over predicting, you might ask? And I'll tell you. Most players who play Forsaken get 70 plus ping, which isn't really that bad. I'd say anything lower than 130 is decent enough. Like, if you want to react to animations, you'll probably want around 60 or lower, preferably 50 or lower. It's not impossible, depending on the killer's ping and what killer they're using, but reacting on higher amounts of ping is just a spitfire way to completely fail your block. Also, frames can contribute to reacting a lot. If you average really high frames, you'll just be a beast at reacting. But not everyone has a decent PC, I myself included, so the majority of people will struggle a lot with reacting. Ping and frames affect all survivors, but it definitely affects these four the most. Sadly, in Guest's case, it's one of the biggest things that can determine if you're a basic guest or a pro guest. Charge is almost useless in flat maps. Like, honestly, who realistically wants to use charge in almost any situation that doesn't have elevated ground? Unless you're using it to help a survivor by extending their loop, or trying to get the killer's attention so they leave somebody else alone, it's just about as useless as you're gonna get, especially in a map with no elevated ground. I mean, like, I know it can help a little, but most of the time against a competent killer, you'll just be buying yourself a few extra seconds. Unlike all of Guest's other abilities, I have no issue with this one. I know some people complain about the wind-up, or talk about how easy it is to avoid, but you can say the same thing about every other stunner in the game. All Sentinels either have an audio cue or an animation that gives them away. Well, almost all. The only issue with Punch is it's locked behind the most easy thing in the game to fail. Off the topic of his abilities, another reason why I think Guest is so bad is when you compare him to his competition, or the other survivors he could play, Guest really isn't that appealing. All other Sentinels have a much easier stun to land than Guest. Literally no other survivor has a harder stun to use, and that's all because of how you get a punch. Two-Time and Chiletsky have no lock on their stun, and all Chance has to do is gamble. Guest, on the other hand, has to successfully use the most obvious ability in the game, and then pray to God that it works. Like, the only people who use Guest are competitive players and level grinders. I know there are a lot of exceptions to this rule, and a lot of other people do use him, but realistically, anybody else who uses him that I've encountered has just not been that good. Also, before I get off of competition, why are all Milestone 4 Guests so bad? I know not all of them are, but it's almost a curse when you see a Milestone 4 Guest that they just suck. They cannot get a block. I don't know. Somebody let me know. Anyways, the final thing that I think makes Guest bad is the insane amount of text required to even use him properly. Like, the amount of Guest text I've seen is just wild. The lag tech, the AFK tech, the emote tech, the item tech, the charge tech, the Godzilla tech, and just so many more. I'm not even going to go into how many techs you can perform with 2 players. It's just way too much. It's a lot to know and understand, which can make Guest a pretty big turnoff for players who don't feel like locking in every single time they play the game. Not to mention, at least 80% of all Guest techs are useless unless you have the most specific setup to do them. You either need a coordinated team or straight luck, and on top of all of that, once again, even after you go through the most insane setup just for a singular block, more often than not, a killer can just bait it out, and all of that time's just been wasted. Guest is the only Sentinel that completely relies on the killer in order to play properly. All it takes is one smart killer to make all of your build-up worthless. I think this just about wraps up my Guest rant. There are probably a lot more points that go against Guest that I just don't know because I don't use him too often. But with that said, there are probably also some things in his favor that I don't know because, again, I just don't use him often. I'd really like to see your guys' opinions down below. It would help me get a better understanding of Guest, maybe better explain certain things, or even go against some of the stuff I say. I love reading your guys' comments, and I enjoy seeing the ideas ideas and concepts and whatnot. Anyways, that's just about enough for today's video. This has been Wendigo, and I am going to sleep now.